In this video, we're going to go over the thinking it through questions on page 172. Question number 1. In what ways are the structures of these various governments similar? Local, provincial, or territorial, federal, First Nations, and Métis. In all those groups, all representatives are nominated and elected through the voting of constituents. Each level of government has a leader and elected representatives that represent groups of people from certain areas or constituencies. Each level of government is involved in making decisions to make life better for citizens in the region. Okay, question number 2. Create a chart or other graphic to compare and contrast the responsibilities of municipal, provincial, or territorial, federal, and First Nations and Métis governments. Okay, so we'll just go down the column from my sheets. The federal government is responsible for numerous items. They're responsible for national concerns, national defense, finance, treasury, justice, Indian and Northern Affairs, which has been now renamed to be, I believe, First Nations and Indigenous Affairs, making laws, the Supreme Court, international issues, and national parks. Provincial governments are responsible for provincial concerns, children's services, health and wellness, energy, education, seniors and community support, tourism and parks, provincial courts, resources, Aboriginal relations, agriculture and food, and provincial parks. Municipal governments, so this could be town, village, city, rural municipality, rural county. They are in charge of their local concerns. Seniors facilities, public transportation, fire protection, waste disposal, parks and recreation, passing bylaws, libraries, streets and roads, animal control, and towns and parks. First Nations and Métis governments are in charge of their local concerns, so on or off reserve. They are in charge of their education, economic development, protection of treaty rights, community buildings, sports and recreation, housing, managing funds from the federal government, the roads on the reserves, and managing reserve land. Question number 3. How are the structures and functions of different levels of government interrelated? Okay, so for the federal, provincial, municipal, and First Nations and Métis, the federal and provincial have an executive body, so that is your prime minister or premier and your cabinet. Then they have legislative, which would be your parliament or your legislature that make the laws. Excuse me. And then they have the judicial system. Municipalities and First Nations have committees and they have their bylaws. For the federal and provincial governments, they have parliamentary procedures and political parties, whereas most municipalities and First Nations, they don't have either of those. The federal and provincial government both have cabinets. Municipal governments and First Nations usually don't. They both usually have councils. And in the federal and provincial government, they have representation of the Queen. So at the federal level, that is our Governor General. And at the provincial level, our Lieutenant Governor. Federal and provincial both have Crown land. Municipalities have town zoning, and First Nations have land claims and reserve lands. At the federal level for leaders, they have a prime minister as the head of government. Provincial, they have a premier. At the municipal level, they usually have a mayor if it's a village or town. If it's an RM, it's a reeve. And on the First Nations, the leader is the chief. For representation, Federal governments have members of parliament that represent their constituents. Provincial have members of the legislative assembly, which may be called something different depending on the province you're in. And they also represent their constituents. In municipalities, they have councillors who represent town residents, city areas, or RM areas. And on First Nations reserves, they have councillors who represent the band members. At the federal government, now this is usually, the elections are every 4 years, but they can go to 5 years under certain circumstances now. The Harper government brought in set election years, but they are not set in stone. They are supposed to happen every 4 years, but they can be called earlier. In Saskatchewan, we do have set election laws as well. But last year we had a federal election at close to the same time as our provincial election, so they pushed that election back until this fall. So it's actually going to be closer to 5 years. Municipalities, they have elections usually every 2 years, and on First Nations reserves usually every 2 years as well. At the federal level, they deal with Indian or Northern Affairs, as it used to be called, or First Nations or Indigenous Affairs now. Provincial level, it's Aboriginal Relations. And municipal level, they try to have inclusive municipal programs that recognize all people, not just First Nations, but other minority groups. And at the First Nations and Métis level, they have federal and provincial relations with their local residents. Now, for taxation, at the federal level, they have the Treasury, the Finance Department, and they collect taxes such as GST and income tax. At the provincial level, they do charge taxes as well, PST and income tax. At the municipal level, they will charge property tax based on the value of your land holdings and business taxes. On First Nations reserves, they manage funds from the federal government and have tax exemption on the reserve. For transportation at the ground level, I guess you could say, federal government usually is not involved with that, but they will provide funding for various projects. But highways are the responsibility of provincial governments. Towns and RMs are in charge of their local roads, and First Nations are in charge of reserve roads. And as mentioned earlier on in the previous question, provinces are in charge of education in the province, and First Nations are in charge of education on their reserves. Same thing with health. The provincial government is in charge of health for the whole province, and First Nations are in charge of their health on reserve, which is funded by the federal government, which is, unfortunately, both education and health are underfunded on reserve compared to the non-reserve members in the provinces. Question 4. Which level of government do you think is most important? Why? So your answers can vary quite a bit on this one. Federal government might be said to be the most important because they are in charge of the armed forces, which might be important to some of you, or international affairs. But really, when it comes down to it, local government has more influence on the day-to-day life of students. So your local roads, your recreational activities. Myself, I kind of lean towards the provincial government being the most important for me because they are the ones in charge of healthcare and education. So they control our curriculum, our funding for our school. Now remember, the provincial government is only responsible for education in schools that are not on reserve. On-reserve schools are funded by the federal government and managed by the First Nations bands, but the federal government does not give the First Nation bands as much money as our provincial government gives our school, for example. Now, if you were from a First Nations band, you would probably think that your local First Nations government would be the most important to you because they are in charge of maintaining treaty rights, land claims, and on reserve recreation and health. So essentially, the reserve government takes the role of the local and provincial government on reserve compared to those who live off a reserve. Okay, question number 5. How does the government work in Canada? How does each level of government contribute to making Canada a good place to live? Okay, so the federal government deals with defense and protecting our rights internationally, deals with national parks and national environment protection. They have created the rights protected in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and are in charge of the RCMP to protect everyone. Now, for the provincial government, it deals with protecting energy and provincial land, deals with provincial parks and resource management, in charge of provincial laws to protect environment and resources. And in some provinces, they actually have a provincial police. We in Saskatchewan, in the rural municipalities, the provincial government actually pays the RCMP to provide that service for us. Municipal governments deal with local businesses and local parks, deal with recreational facilities and leisure programs, bylaws about noise, pets, local parks, speed on the grids, for example. And they, depending on the municipal government, they pay for the city police or the RCMP. Now, the RM of Pence does have to pay the RCMP, but they are actually subsidized by the provincial government as well. For Métis and First Nations peoples, they protect the treaty rights and deal with land claims, deal with the use of reserve land and housing, recreation, and sports, and protects treaty rights. And they are also in charge of their local security. So some reserves will actually have a reserve police force, or will have the have the RCMP patrol their reserves for them.